Starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar on the EPA's new Refrigerant Management Rule. We're glad you could join us. My name is Sylvia Liebhardt. I am a receptionist and Special Projects Coordinator at Triumvirate Environmental. Before we get started, I'd like to give you a brief overview on what the webinar is going to entail as we run through a few housekeeping items. Everyone's mic will be on mute for the entirety of the webinar, but if you have a question or technical issue, you may use the questions pane to communicate. Following the presentation, there will be an open Q&A period. You can ask questions by typing them into your questions pane on the right. Any unanswered questions will be followed up on or after the webinar in the coming days. Please keep in mind you will receive a copy of the slide deck and recording tomorrow. Rick Foote has over 25 years of experience in the field of environmental health and safety and is currently Director of Industrial Practice for Triumvirate. Rick has been with Triumvirate for over 12 years, where he has established dozens of successful EH&S programs for companies that had few or no systems in place. Each EH&S program that Rick develops is customized to the individual's client's needs. With that, I will turn things over to Rick.
Thank you, Sylvia. So good afternoon, everybody, and welcome. So today we're going to talk about the new Clean Air Act regulations regarding refrigeration management. And, if I could ask you all to raise your hand of how many of you know a lot about this, right? So I don't think we're seeing any hands get raised, right? So unfortunately, but fortunately, that's what we're here today to do, is to talk about the changes in these rules and how it may or may not affect you. The good news in most of this is for you being the end user, if you will, of the refrigerants, is that there is relatively limited requirements that you're going to need to follow. So with that, I am going to go through kind of an overview of all of this and then highlight some of the specific changes that, that are going to come out of it, or what the intent of the rule actually is. And then at the end, hopefully we can have some time to answer some questions for you that you may or may not have regarding the new rule. So with that so the EPA has published this rule. And again, if you're familiar with it or not, but the actual title of it is the National Recycling and Emission Management Program. And the whole purpose of this, as you can see here on the slide, really is to reduce our use and emissions of CFCs and HCFCs. And really to push more and more the recapturing and the recycling of these materials. As before in the past, really it was all about anything that had 50 pounds or more of refrigerants, and now the rules have actually lowered that down quite substantially, down to 5 pounds. But again, as I mentioned earlier, most of these requirements go more to the individuals or companies that you hire to actually clean out these machines, this equipment or anything like that. So most of the burden is going to fall on them, but obviously there's also a burden to you. And that's really where I want to focus on for the most part today, is to talk about what is that burden to you. So here's kind of an outline, and this did come from a webinar that the EPA had put together. Some of you may or may not have seen it. And really what it is this is really a nice pie chart, in my opinion. I wish I was this creative, is to say that this is what it's all about, right? And we start, it really does, it focuses heavily on the technician certifications. As I said, there's a lot of the role that goes to the technicians, and we'll talk briefly about that. I'm not going to get too heavily in that, but more that you want to ensure that whoever you are using to recycle or to charge any of your equipment is actually certified properly. There's also some sales restrictions on what types of refrigerants that you're allowed to buy. So some of these are going to get phased out. I am not going to get into anything in the automotive, for your car air conditioner, if you will. We're looking more at the commercial units that are in your facilities, to keep it cool, or, if you got ice rinks or whatever it is, whoever, the gamut of you that are on this call. Also in there, it talks about service practices, what is allowed, what isn't allowed. Recovery and recycling equipment is all going to have to be certified. Now, it's a third-party certification that really says the equipment actually works. And the old days, as I remember when I was younger, we used to take these things and just puncture a hole right in the tank and let the refrigerants go everywhere. And I got Sylvia here shaking her head. Yes, she remembers it too. So, and a lot of us probably do remember that, right? Well, those days we can't do anymore. There is some heavy burden on record keeping, but again, most of that burden goes to the technicians that are servicing the units and not necessarily towards you, but there is certain records that you want to prove that you are in compliance with the new rules. And then from there you go to repairing any leaks. As most of you know, there's strict requirements on when you need to report any leakage in your equipment. And you got the 24-hour rule, then you got the annual rule, so there was some changes to that, as well as appliance disposal. I mentioned it right away that the old rule was the 50-pound rule of refrigerant. So for most of us, we would think, oh, big chiller units or, really big units versus, we may not have included simpler things like maybe a water cooler, right? But now with the new rule at 5 pounds, well, there could be, and it depends on the water cooler. I'm not going to sit here and give, oh, this one or that one, but it's more or less saying, yeah, we got to look at everything we have. And because depending on, now it may change where you can dispose of it, or more importantly, how you dispose of it, or who you use to dispose of it. So all of those pieces play into this, and it's important that you're looking at all of those aspects. And then obviously, last but not least, is how do you reclaim it, which is, again, either if you have your own people on site or if you hire an outside company. Either way, there's some requirements, which we're going to get into most of these throughout this presentation. All right. So as most of you probably know, or you should know, right, the Montreal Protocol was really put into place, and this is where the United States, this is not to be confused with the one that President Trump is trying to, remove us from. This one's already in place. And it was really an international effort, let me try that again, an international effort to end the use of these ozone depleting substances. And, depending on which side of the coin you want to be on, right, we all know that the ozone layer is getting depleted. And, you can say that it's one thing or the other. Right? I know just a few weeks ago there was a publication that came out that said we are indeed causing, destruction of the ozone layer. And we also know scientifically that these CFCs or HCFCs definitely have an effect on the ozone layer. So this was what this whole regulation was to say, all right, let's get rid of these. Let's phase them out over a period of time so that there is less of them and we're not necessarily adding to the destruction of the ozone layer. So the whole thing here is all part of these rules, and I have some timelines built into the presentation too, is to say that yes, we want to cut down the production as well as the import of these materials. And then over a period of time, then it would become banned, but it's not necessarily, like a ban. It's more of a phase out to allow you to use what you already have or to use equipment, and hopefully the equipment end of service life will be before the actual phase out period has to be. But for some of you, it could be that you need to replace equipment at some point that has banned substances. So here we go with some of the timelines for this phase out. Some of these have already passed, as you can see here, but some of them are upcoming, and really the meat of this, if you will, is upcoming, and that's why we are talking about this today, is the EPA has really been pushing it out there and saying, okay, how many people are aware of this? And I know I've talked to a lot of my clients about it recently, and not a lot of them, either they were completely unaware of the change in the rules, or they were like, yeah, we know about it, but we haven't really dug into it. So the purpose of today is hopefully just to start that conversation with you to say, all right, we got a couple of deadlines coming up that you should be aware of that you may want to start sitting down and thinking about how do we get to achieve these goals that need to be met down the road. So as you can see here, 2010, which is long but past, they wanted to achieve a 75% reduction of the goal. And then 2015 was, again, more servicing and really getting to a 90% reduction. So in 5 years, it's another 15% reduction on the use of these materials. So, and this is for all HCFCs, okay, versus just the number 22 and the 142B. So you can see it's pretty aggressive here, what they're looking for as far as timelines. And really what we want to talk about here, and here's where the real crust of this comes in, is what is regulated. Okay, and it's really anything that's considered ozone depleting refrigerants. And there's plenty of lists out there that are published with this. So I'm not going to get into a lot of details, which ones they are there or they aren't they, but it's really everything that's out there. Okay, that anything that can be considered ozone depleting must be included in this. And it also includes anything in here that, if you're familiar with section 608 of the rules, that already has any of the venting prohibition. What we mean by that is you're not allowed to discharge these anyways, unrecycled or reclaimed to the atmosphere. So it included all of the other materials that weren't already included in this rule. Okay, so everything is going to be basically by the 2018 and or 2019, and they're really looking for you to say, okay, can we substitute that material? So ideally, part of the rule is, all right, if you have a affected refrigerant, can you replace it with a non-affected refrigerant? So it's all about a replacement. So you're using, to say it in more layman's term, right, something less toxic for the ozone layer than something that's more toxic, right, is the easier way to really say this. Okay, so there is some, exempt substitute refrigerants, like I say on here, is ammonia and CO2. Okay, so there is other things too that say, that these aren't included, but please keep in mind that these rules were not all about just to say, okay, this is the only rule that I have to follow is the Clean Air Act. Is don't forget with ammonia, right? Ammonia could also tie into a process safety management or, under OSHA. So you got to take into consideration too when you're changing out any substitute refrigerants that there may be other requirements above and beyond the EPA section 608 that you also have to consider. So there's a lot of pieces to this. This is just one part of it. Okay, so here's a great, chart, if you will. And again, I just really like to stress, this came out of the EPA, and, they're saying here, okay, here's what we're talking about for the exempt refrigerants. All of these materials are exempt, and you'll really see how they're used in the end use. You see here we use CO2 or nitrogen, water, right, for like water coolers and things like that. But ammonia is, again, retail refrigerant. So you're kind of looking at this and just saying, oh, okay, this is what they mean and where they're typically applied. This isn't meant to be an all-inclusive list. This is just to try to give you an idea and to say, okay, this is where we may find these types of materials. And really what it comes down to, and I'm going to stress this again later on, is to say to you, how many of you, and this could have been a great poll question, but I didn't think of it until just now, is to say of you, and you can answer this on your own, right, is how many of you have a very good inventory of all of the refrigerants, all of the refrigerants that you have at your facility, and then the volumes. So how much is the volume in each piece of equipment, and then what is the refrigerant within that equipment? Is because that's really where the whole value of this is going to come in to say, is it regulated or is it exempt? And you really need to know what the volume of that is within it, because if it's 5 pounds or more, then it's going to be potentially regulated, and especially when it comes to a disposal. Then is it one of those materials that the EPA has said is ozone depleting? Because then now you're going to be on a timeline here to phase that out, or it's going to get phased out at some point, and then it will really behoove you to say, okay, can we just replace it, replace the refrigerant, or do we actually have to replace the entire unit, which could then become a capital investment depending on what the type of unit is. So these are all the questions that get triggered throughout this process. So these are the things that you really got to dig in and be thinking about. Okay. So let's go into some of the highlights of these specific changes. because this is really where the old saying goes, right? The rubber meets the road, is to say, okay, what does this mean for me? And as I stated right from the very beginning of this, really the crust of this goes to the technicians. And there is some changes to technician certifications. And really what it is to say that, and again, it could be that you hire an outside company. If you're hiring an outside company, you really, really, really want to do your homework and ensure that they have the correct credentials, that they are properly certified, that they have everything they need starting January 1 of next year. Or do you have your own internal people that are doing this? And if it is internal people, are they correctly certified also? Okay, so it clearly states in there that in order to open up any of these appliances, right, is the way they call it, is you must be properly certified. Okay, as you can see here, is not requiring recertification of current technicians at this time. So what it's saying here, this is really more for the newer technicians, on what they're doing and how they do it. It's not an old requirement of saying, okay, well, if you're doing it, you've already been doing it for a long time, okay. But, you may really want to consider, as I always say, they should be, up to date on the new rules and the changes and, all of those things. But, it really is that you want to make sure of that. As you can see here, too, is that basically starting anybody that was certified beginning of this year, of 2017, they're actually going to be posting a list of all of the new technicians, which is going to be helpful to you being the end user, that over a period of time here is that as everybody gets recertified or certified, I should say, right, is that you can go to this list and say, oh yeah, John Smith, yeah, he's on that list from, ABC refrigerant recycling. So again, it's, you can ask them directly for their licenses, or you'll be able to go to a resource and say, it's right there. It's going to make life a lot easier on everybody. Technicians can opt out of this, i.e. they can say, you know what, no, I'm not going to do this type of work. So they do have that option of doing that, but they, obviously it may not be lucrative to them, because then they're going to be limited on the types of units that they can work with. Okay. Again, they're removing, the EPA is the big one, that the technicians can certify their own equipment. That is a big change to the rules, because now it's actually got to be a third-party certification. I always thought that was a little bit of a stranger rule, right? It's kind of like the fox watching the hen house. Is, I can say, oh yeah, my equipment works great, right? And it may not that I'm, people may not intentionally do that, but it always breeds that potential. And at least here, you're going to know that, yes, we sent it off to, XYZ company. They certified that my equipment is operating properly. So it's going to give you the reassurance that the materials that they're recycling for you are actually being recycled. So there is also some sales restrictions here, too, on what you'll be able to purchase or not to purchase. Okay, so in order to be able to purchase any of the HFCs, is again, starting at the beginning of the year, is you're going to have to be a certified technician. So I know you're probably looking at this and saying, well, wait a minute, the other side said I don't have to get certified, but now I got to get, yeah. So in reality is, if you think about it, right, almost everybody's going to have to get certified at some point, or you're going to have a harder time, or you're going to have to get somebody that is certified to be able to do it. Okay, so then if any of you on this call are a distributor of refrigerants, well, guess what? You got to maintain the records of those sales starting January 1st too, i.e. who did I sell it to? So you're going to need to ensure that, one, they're certified. Two, you're going to need to keep the records. So the record keeping burden goes back to you, and then you're going to have to maintain those. So it's all the trackability, or like we like to say, it's almost like a cradle to grave now for refrigerants, is say the cradle in this particular case would be the sales part of it, where the grave would be, once it's finally recycled on the other end. As you can see here too, I said I briefly mentioned on motor vehicles, and they are not subject to this. Anything on, the real small cans that you can buy at, an auto parts store or something like that, as long as they're under 2 pounds, are not subject to this sales restriction. So I know, I have a friend that I know, he fills his own, and, in his car. So you're still going to be allowed to do that. That's not covered under here, as long as it's less than 2 pounds in the cans that you're purchasing. Okay, so the service practices. So here's a big one is, again, they must, so the technicians themselves, and this to me, yes, when you read this, a lot of people say, well, it's not my problem, right? I hired this company to do it, so they must do it all right. Well, I always say yes and no, right? You also want to make sure that whoever you're using is doing it properly, right? So that there is no liability potentially back to you that they did something wrong. And also to know that, hey, I'm using a reputable company that has the right equipment. So what you want to do as a business may be make sure that, all right, is their equipment certified, if they're opening up any of this equipment. So it's got to, as I mentioned earlier, it is certified by a third party. And that's all starting at the beginning of January 1. So I think there's going to be probably a little bit of a scramble, between now and then. I have reached out to a couple of refrigerant companies, and they're saying, yeah, we're in good shape. But others are like, yeah, we're panicking a little bit. But so it really just comes down to who are you using. Okay, so again, it's all about is they have to make sure that they're removing enough of the refrigerant, when they actually are doing this too, so that those levels have changed, which again, it's all about the technician, but I want you to be aware of it. So anything here, any new equipment that's been created, anything since January 1st would have already had to been certified. So again, when talking to some of these refrigeration companies, they were saying that a lot of them were just like, well, we're just replacing older equipment with the new equipment that's already certified. So, I kind of, when I heard that, I said to myself, well, here's probably a potential, right, that they're going to raise their prices to do this, because now they got to pay for that equipment. So it's a little bit of all of that in there too. And, the EPA did adopt also the United Laboratories here, Underwriters Laboratories, flammability standard as part of the certification if you're using flammable refrigerants. Again, they've not used too much of this. I'm not aware of a lot of places that use it. But if you are, they just adopted those standards also as part of this because they felt like those were stringent enough, and so they just directly adopted them instead of saying, okay, we're going to write our own rules on top of those. You have to follow those instead. All right. So this does affect you as an end user of the materials, is the leak rates and duty to repair. This is not new. It is just some additions to it and some changes to it that in the past where they said, okay, we got to make some changes to these rules to ensure that everything is done properly. So starting in 2019, so we keep saying 2018 was really all the certified equipment and stuff, and now it's 2019, is that these new requirements will play in. And you'll notice it applies to all refrigerants, excluding anything that was exempt earlier on in the regulations. Okay, so the listing, again, the existing leak repairs will continue, okay, for most appliances all the way up to 2019. Okay, but here's where the leak rate, comes into play. It's every time, any refrigerant is added to an appliance containing 50 pounds or equal to or greater than 50 pounds of refrigerant. Okay, so you've got to figure out all right, what is our leak rate? And if you look down below, you'll see that they actually lowered that leak rate. So you'd have to figure out is how much do we actually lose every time we add a refrigerant to it. Because, I know of a case where I had a client that had, they were adding refrigerant because they kept seeing it go down, but it wasn't reportable because they just had to figure out if it's an industrial process refrigeration. All right, at the time, it was 35%. So if I'm losing less than 35%, I didn't have to report it. But now that rate is actually dropped down to 30%. So they've lowered these pretty substantially. And if you see the next one down for commercial refrigeration, so again, your larger, anybody here owns a grocery store or a commercial warehouse that has, refrigeration or something like that. So they lowered it by 15% here. It's now down to 20% from 35%. So that's quite a major change, and that could affect some of you that would now be, you now would have to repair these units. Okay, and then for, comfort cooling, so again, your regular AC type of units, they lowered that by 5% down to 10%. So again, it's just telling you now that, all right, if we discover that this equipment is leaking at that rate, we must repair it. You've either got to repair or replace. It's that simple. If you can repair it, great. But sometimes, again, depending on the end of service life of that particular unit, you may or may not want to, you may just want to replace it. Okay, so the whole idea is the repair that you do to it is going to get it down below the reporting threshold. So all of your equipment would then be compliant and you wouldn't have to worry about it. So again, there's a lot of record keeping here, and you kind of want to make sure that you have all of the data that you need is to ensure that the equipment is actually falling within these levels. So some changes to leak repair is you also have to do verification tests. So this is a little bit different, as you have to demonstrate that the repairs worked. So, again, they're going to tell you how to do that, okay, is you have to do the initial test, which says that basically, you may pressurize the system, right, and make sure, okay, guess what, nothing's leaking out, or, something along those lines, and you've got to do that before you can add the refrigerant back in, which somewhat makes sense, right, because you don't want you to add in the refrigerant and then find out, uh-oh, guess what, we didn't fix the leak, and we just lost, another 40% of the refrigerant that we put in there. That's not good. So then you have to do also a follow-up test, and that's done after you've repaired the appliance and you let it run back, it's all returned back to normal operating conditions. And, so you got to kind of wait, make sure, oh yeah, everything's leveled out, and the system is fully operational where it should be, and then you got to make sure too that you don't have any leaks at that point. Okay, so it is coming down to that. It's kind of like making sure that everything is working correctly and that things were successful. Okay, if either of these tests indicates the repairs weren't successful, then guess what? You got to do it again within a 30-day period. So they really, really want to make sure that it's not just like, hey, we all love duct tape, right? So we take duct tape and we throw the duct tape on the piping, and yeah, it all works, right? We're all good, Homer Simpson fix, right? Put some bubble gum on it, whatever works, right? So they really, really want you to make sure that the fix actually works, which to me only makes sense, right? But, again, obviously this wasn't being done. As I always say, they don't make up rules if people were doing everything correctly. So just to kind of give you, also what is the definition of an appliance, because, we keep talking about in the rule, if any of you have read the rule, it talks a lot about appliances, like a water cooler is an appliance, right? So they want to make sure that you understand that it's, what it is. And I read this definition and I go, okay, this clarified a lot. I don't know about you, but for me it says clarifies that each independent circuit in a system with multiple circuits is a separate appliance. Which basically said what? I read it to say, okay, so I can unplug it and plug it in, or, things like that. So again, you got to really figure it out to say to yourself, all right, what am I doing? What are we looking at? How are we, and you want to make sure that you are defining all of your equipment properly too. That's really what I'm trying to get out of that, is to say, okay, what is a real appliance? What am I looking at? Why am I not including this versus that? Because does it meet this? Does it fall into the right categories? Because just about everything is going to fall into this. Okay, and then so your calculations too, it provides that you do that rolling average method. This has become a big thing within the Clean Air Act, right? Is we're always looking at a rolling average. So it's over that 12-month period. We're always looking at everything that, it's no longer on a calendar year. It's more like, you can do February to January, March to February. You're kind of looking at it on that to make sure that everything is successful. Okay, and you'll notice here the record keeping is the technicians have to provide you, they need to provide you, the owner or operator, with an invoice that includes how much refrigerant did they add, if they did a leak test, and the verification of those tests. So you do have some record keeping requirements here, being the end user, is so they want to make sure that they're actually telling you everything that you need to know, so that you can also should be able to verify that that they did what they should be doing, and that you have physical proof that says, yes, it was fixed properly. They told me that they did it. I know what type of refrigerant they added, and more importantly, how much did they add? because you want to be able to track that in your own inventory. And because if you don't do that, then you're not going to know what equipment may or may not be regulated. And I love it in here because they did say that electronic record keeping is encouraged in this rule. So finally, right, now we're finally getting the regulatory agencies to say, let's go digital. I think that's a major step in a lot of this because, you know, a lot of times we always say, oh, you need that hard paper copy, and yet it's a heck of a lot easier when you have it in an electronic form, I think, especially if you don't like math like me. And, you know, it's easier math to do it in an Excel spreadsheet or something like that, you know you're not screwing it up, basically. Okay? So, changes also to appliance disposal. This is where, you know, where a lot of the part of the changes came in, because I said originally was that 50-pound rule. So again, here you'll see any appliance with 5 pounds or less really are not covered in here. Okay, again, you know, you want to make sure it's safe disposal. You want to, hopefully you recycle the refrigerant. Hopefully you bring it to, you know, wherever that they will successfully and properly, you know, vent that material out so that it's not, you know, regulated. But really where it comes in here is anything between that 5 and 50. This is really where it comes into play. There is new records for disposal of these that, again, anything 5 to 50, and you'll see on here what you need to have as part of those records is, okay, what was there, right? What company name, location, date of recovery, the type of refrigerant recovered for each, how much was recovered, okay, in each calendar month. So this is all record keeping, but again, you'll notice at the bottom here it says must be maintained by the technician and not the owner or operator of the appliance. So, but remember, if you're using your own technicians, right, those technicians are your employees, so therefore you will need to keep those records. So, however, if you're using a third party, then you don't need to do that because they're basically going to take, if you will, ownership, and I use that word ownership a little bit lightly, because really that is what it is, right, is they're going to say that, yeah, we took everything, this is who we got it from, this is what we did with it, and this is where it's going and to be disposed of, and we recycle back everything that we could out of it. So it's very, very important records here. As you can see, I think that the bigger part of this rule change was a lot more in the record keeping realm, that they really wanted a lot of records to be able to make sure that people knew what to do with it. Okay, so why do they do this, and what is the real hope, right? So when they did all of this, you can see it here. You know, when I looked at it, I said, okay, it's a major change in the rule. However, the major change doesn't necessarily affect you as the end user as much as the person that's actually recycling or reclaiming the material prior to disposal. But what the EPA really said was, you know, by promoting the safe handling of these refrigerants, and you can see here what the reductions are, which are quite huge when you start looking at it, and, you know, how much of the material that they're going to be, you know, how many annual, you know, greenhouse gas reduction here, look at 7.3, you know, million tons, you know, metric tons here of CO2 equivalent, you know, are, you know, again, our overall reduction is 140, cost is about $24.5 million. That's the compliance cost. So, you know, you can tell the compliance cost is going to go up. I cannot sit here and to say to you that, you know, I don't think that the, you know, the cost initially is going to go up, but over time it'll go down, because if you're fixing things properly, if you know your equipment is working properly and all of that, then you won't have to purchase. And you'll notice the EPA even estimates about $44 million in savings over a period of time here, because you're not going to have to put as much refrigerant back in. And you probably, some of you may be saying, again, is sitting there saying, yeah, we know we have certain equipment that leaks, you know, that's currently leaking, right? Or that every year we got to have it serviced. And, you know, if every year you got to have it serviced, and every year the, you know, your refrigerant, you know, your HVAC people are adding refrigerant to it, you have a leak. And that's the whole crust of this rule, is to try to prevent the releases, you know, and really have you repair all of these. And to say that, okay, we're not going to have to do that every time. And if you don't have to do it all the time, right, you don't have to do all that record keeping. You don't have to spend that money. You know, you can put that, reinvest that money somewhere else, maybe in newer equipment down the road instead. And also the EPA said too, is that they look at the overall greenhouse gas reduction, is about the equivalent to, 1.5 million cars in a year. So that's a lot of cars if you think about it, right? And it's a lot of greenhouse gases that we can potentially eliminate. And we all know, right, when the EPA projects these things, that they're either too high or too low. What I've read, they think that this could be too low, that they actually think it could, if the rule gets fully implemented and enacted the way it should, that number could vastly go up, which is only good for all of us, right, in the air we breathe. So what are the real results of this is, again, they wanted to make sure that everything is consistently treated instead of, okay, well, this one's over here, that one's over there, and, we don't look at everything. So they wanted to make sure that they took the best of all worlds, if you will, blended it all together and say, all right, let's look at everything and manage everything the same exact way, which to me makes life a lot easier. I'm all about, okay, if everybody's doing the same thing, it's easier to manage. It's easier to understand. There is no, well, wait a minute, that's exempt over here, so maybe not over there. It just, to me, it breeds, an issue or, a non-compliance potential. So that part of it I really, really liked. It also ensured that repairs are effective, because in the previous rules, it really didn't say much in there. Yeah, some people could say, well, they had some of that, but they weren't as strict with the verification process. Like I said, yeah, you can put duct tape on it. It isn't leaking, right? Or the old taillight guarantee, right? As soon as the guy drove away, well, it's fixed, and it could start leaking. They really got, I'm somewhat joking on that, but, it is saying that they wanted to make sure that people knew that that's what it was. They really did, and I read through the rules quite a bit, and I figured out to say that, I think the rules did become much clearer, did become much clearer in there of saying that, okay, now you can read them and you can almost understand them. I always say almost, because I know, like any other regulations, is, you really need to make sure that everything is fixed properly, okay? And it also says here you're removing, some of these obsolete requirements, things that are just nobody has anymore. It had a lot of older regulations in there from when, the Clean Air Act of '90 and beyond, right? Some of this stuff has been in the rules for a long time. Do is it, when you're looking at it, do you have to say, okay, where am I at with this? So I think it really, really helps in that aspects. Okay, so just real quick here on the flammable refrigerants. And again, I don't know of a lot of you that may or may not be, working with these things. Is it does say here, you just got to make sure that you're following the rules on these, right? Because it's all about the venting of them. So some of the requirements is there are new self-contained small appliances, again, specifically used to use these. That's okay. They don't anticipate that you need to open these up for servicing or recharging, because it's more or less what I like to call these as a one-time use type of, unit. So you're going to kind of use them and you're not going to recharge them. And then once it's done, you would just basically dispose of them. So that's why the EPA is saying, that's not such a big deal with those. What's nice about them is they're going to actually be, they should be, or they're supposed to be, let me rephrase that, right, is easily identifiable. So it's really in there to say to you that, yes, you really want to look at this stuff and say, this is what we need. This is the way it should be, and I know it because why? I see the red tubing. Red, we all know red normally means flammable, right? Or some other marking that it will say on there that says this is a flammable refrigerant. And really, it's almost like, I wish they would have came out with and said, non-rechargeable, kind of like a non-rechargeable battery, right? That would have been the easy way to do this, but that's not quite what the regulation said. Okay, so, again, here's some more of this too, is again, it's illegal to use anything in an existing, so you can't take the flammable refrigerants, such as R22A in any existing, again, this is true even when the refrigerant is sold by a certified technician or not, so you got to be careful that some people, say, oh, can I just put something else in it? You got to be careful too on what you're putting in there. But again, there's certain restrictions even on the flammables that can only be purchased by certified technicians. So it really comes down to, when you're looking at it, is you got to make sure that everything is done properly. And you really want to make sure that whoever you're using doing it, your technicians, and I can kind of said, I know it doesn't say you got to get recertified, but it's really going to behoove you to make sure that whoever you are using moving forward is properly certified so that you know that they understand the new rules and that they're following and playing by the same rules so that you don't end up getting in trouble down the road. That's really the best way to say it. So kind of, in summary here to say it is very simply, you really need to have the inventory, right? You really, really need to have an inventory of what do you have. Anything 5 pounds or greater, and some of the rules kick in, depending on what unit you're at and where you're at, that's really how it's all going to play into you. But if you don't know what you have, it's going to be hard to know if you're regulated. Okay, that's number one. Number two would be to say to yourselves, all right, who am I using to repair my equipment? Who am I using to recycle? Who am I using to add any type of refrigerants to my units? I really, really want to make sure that they're doing everything properly. Granted, and I'll stress this again, most of the burden relies on them. However, you don't want to be caught up on the other end either and saying, oh, great, now they got in trouble, we used them, are we going to get in trouble, right? So I'm always the type of saying, hey, I want to make sure whoever I'm using is, like, being a homeowner, I want to make sure they're insured. I want to make sure they have a good record. I want to make sure they're going to do a good job because I don't want to have an issue later on down the road. So it really behooves you to do all of that. So, okay, with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Sylvia.
Thank you, Rick. At this time, we will open the floor to questions. Please use the question box to submit your question. As I mentioned at the beginning, you will receive an email tomorrow with a copy of this presentation. You will also receive a link to a short survey. We would greatly appreciate your feedback on the webinar and any ideas that you have for future topics. Please visit this link. Thank you for participating today, Rick, and thanks to everyone on the line for attending and participating in the Q&A. This concludes today's webinar. Oh, I'm sorry, we do have some questions. I apologize. This question is from Gerald. Are all of these changes certified at 40 CFR 82?
So yes, all of the regulations, if you want to do a Google search for, all I do, very simply is Clean Air Act Section 608, or 40 CFR, 82, any which way. There's a bunch of things out there. There's a great pamphlet, a 2-page pamphlet. You'll see some of it, I used right in this presentation was, because again, I figured why not, right? They're the best ones to get the information from, is they had it right there. So all of the regulations are codified. You'll see them. You can read it. I always suggest that if you really want a lot of detail in this, read the preamble. I think the preamble really, really gives you the information that you need and not just read the regulation. It's not a huge reg. When I say that, if I remember correctly, I want to say it's around 200 pages, which if any of you have read a reg, that isn't a whole lot. But there's a lot of great information that was, about the questions that were submitted to the EPA and all of that. So I think that that's very, very good information to go with. But it's all in there. Yes, those are in there right now. Okay.
Okay, we also have Voitech. For units below 50 pounds of charge, how do you know the leak rate is high enough to render repairs? Can you just keep adding refrigerants without repairs, claiming the leak rate is small?
That's a great question, right? So let's just keep adding to it and not worry about it, right? Well, I mean, you should be able to calculate out the leak rate, right? Because, again, going back to your inventory, if you have a good inventory that says, hey, I know I had 30 pounds of material within refrigerant in that unit, and every week or every 2 weeks, right, I got to add 5 pounds to it. I think that you keep adding to it. One, probably from a cost effectiveness is not a wise decision to do. So technically, yeah, you could do it, right? Because then you can go and look at that 30 or the 20 or the 10%, depending on what the unit is, and saying is, all right, how much am I actually putting in there over a period of time? And it may behoove you to say to yourself, either I got to get it repaired or I got to replace it. So I do not recommend that you just, kind of say, oh, the leak's small. Because again, what is the cost of small too? And as well as what is the intent of this rule, right? The intent of the rule is to protect the ozone layer and also protect your employees, right? You know, that are around this equipment or need to work on it or anything like that. I mean, you really could do the leak rate, I guess, the bottom line. So yes.
Okay, last question. Is the leak repair verification test required only for units with over 50 pounds of charge?
As of now, yes. I do think that may change in the future. But again, if you want to make sure that something's fixed, right, you paid for it, I would just say, hey, I want a verification too. You may not go through all of the hoops that you need to for the units, but I think that it's wise that you look at them and say, okay, this is what we need to do, and to have some type of record of it.
That concludes today's webinar. Have a great rest of the day. Thank you, Rick.